The TJ High Steer conversion takes a little bit of work to do, but the end results will completely transform the way your Jeep handles and drives. Raise and support your Jeep and remove the front tires. Remove the tie rod castle nuts. Now you'll use a 3/4 inch socket to do that, but just leave them started on the studs. That'll protect the stud and the lower groin area from impact when that tie rod pops, drops, and swings. By hitting the arm on the steering knuckle, the tie rod will pop right out without using a boot-destroying pickle fork. Our tie rod was already loose, so he just finished tapping it loose by hitting the tie rod itself. We want to remove the entire steering linkage assembly. This is going to be a happy moment for you. Next, remove the stabilizer shock. You'll use a 15mm and an 18 on the backside. Drain the differential gear loop, just so you won't have to deal with the mess. You know what, you've been wanting to change it anyway. We're lucky enough to have a TeraFlex diff cover on this one, so it's got a drain hole. Now normally you just remove your disc brake rotors at this point, but in this case, the unit bearing and the axle shafts will be removed as an assembly. On the passenger side, remove the three 13mm 12-point unit bearing bolts. If you're real lucky, the bearing will just slide out of the bracket and you can go on to the next step. If you've got my luck, here's the technique. Wind in the 3 bolts you just removed about a 1/4 inch or so. We're going to use them as a wheel puller. If you have an impact hammer, carefully impact the bolts in the center without completely destroying the socket surface. You will need to reinstall these bolts. Work back and forth between the bolts until the bearing starts to separate. Remove the unit bearing and axle as an assembly. Support the inner axle as you slide it out. We want to try to prevent any damage to that inner axle seal. Remove both lower sway bar mount bolts. We used a 3/4 inch socket because of the TeraFlex ST sway bar. For a factory sway bar, you will use a 50 Torx and an 18mm wrench. Remove the frame side track bar nut. It's a 3/4 or a 19mm castle nut. Be sure to leave the castle nut on the stud just to protect the threads and you. Next, remove the axle side track bar bolt. It's going to be a 17mm socket. The rear is held on by a captured nut. Just pull the bolt clear out. That'll release pressure on that track bar. Use the same hammer technique to break the stud loose that we used on the tie rods. Let's do battle with the ball joint cotter keys. We'll use a 7/8 socket on the top and an 1 1/8 on the lower ball joint. Again, start the nuts back on the ball joints to protect the threads and your foot from falling knuckles. When you get tired of jacking with them, just throw a socket on and run the nut off over the top of the cotter keys. You can drive out the sheared off cotter keys later. Now would be a good time to replace your ball joints, should you feel the need. If you couldn't get the cotter keys out, use a flat round punch and some penetrating oil and just punch them out. Remove the passenger side spring. Depending on your lift, you may have to remove the lower shock mount to achieve enough axle droop. We have a spring retainer bracket on this Jeep. With the retainers removed, we will remove the axle bump stop, just to help with the spring removal. Now the fun really begins. We're going to install the 194 3070 bracket, commonly known as the Dave bracket. Now when Dave designed this bracket, he used it to replace the stabilizer shock mount, the track bar mount, as well as the sway bar. So what we're going to do is we're going to need to remove some of this bracket to get it in there, because this is where it mounts up right here. So we're going to do it in stages. Now it looks like Super Tech Adam has already marked some of the spots where we're going to be cutting. So just cut along here, along the back side, down this back side. We're going to remove part of the bracket. Once we've got that piece out of the way, then we can go ahead and set the Dave bracket up against it and cut as we need to make it fit. So it's basically going to go right here. So let's start cutting. Adam's got this stuff pretty much cleaned up now. He left this spring perch really pretty much intact, except for he knocked out that corner because it needs to come around the bracket here. So what we're gonna do is just take the bracket and just do a trim to fit thing on it. We wanna make sure that we have good contact between the axle tube and the bracket here. While I got the pen here, we're gonna go ahead and mark all the spots that we're gonna be welding on, because we gotta do some powder coat removal. So we'll come along that. So just anywhere it's gonna touch, just go ahead and mark this thing up so you can do some welding on it. So we'll do a little more trimming and it's ready to weld on. SuperTech Adam has got this bracket all cleaned up. He's ground off everywhere he's going to be making welds. Any contact point, he's got it cleaned up about a 1/2 inch back all around, so there won't be any contamination in the weld. The final fit, if you can make your bracket look as clean and as sharp angles as he's got it, you've done something. This fits really nice and snug. You can get it up against here, there's no rocking in it. You can look and see that the spots where it's going to weld up on the tube are nice and tight. Both sides here, up along the top, the bracket. This thing fits. I mean, it just is nice and tight and snug. If you can get them to not rock when you get it up there, it's ready to weld. Do a final cleanup and paint the bracket. Primer will help with the longevity of the paint job. With the new bracket in place, it looks like it was meant to be there. Once you've finished admiring your quality work on the bracket on the axle side, it's time to move over to the driver's side of the vehicle, and we're going to add this track bar drop bracket on this side. This bracket is really pretty easy to see where it goes. It has a hole that's going to index with the existing track bar bracket, and we're going to put a bolt through there, and that's going to put it into position. Now this also has a couple of holes in the bracket so that we can drill a hole through the frame, and it's provided with bolts so you can bolt it up. But the guys in the shop here, I mean, they got a welder in their hands. They're really not interested in drilling a bunch of holes. So what we usually do is we'll bolt that one, and then we'll just go ahead and weld it across this, the bracket up on the frame. Now when you're welding on the frame, you don't really want to do a lot of straight line welds clear down the frame because it kind of causes them to crack. And if it does start to crack, it'll follow that weld around. So when we're welding on the frame, we'll just do a couple of spots. We'll maybe weld it up along there, a little weld along there, one on this side. We'll do the same on the back side, maybe just around the corners of it. It's going to be held in a position pretty good with that bolt, so it doesn't take a lot of weld to hold it. Mark the bracket so that you have a quick guide as to where you need to clean the powder coat off before welding. Install the provided 7/16 inch bolt through the bracket and the factory bracket hole. Don't tighten it yet. We want to make sure that the bracket makes good contact with the bottom of the frame. Tightening the bolt might pull the bracket away from the frame a little. You can even use a jack or a C-clamp or just put some pressure on the bracket to push it into place. Check the gap between the frame and the new bracket and position it for best possible welding. Tighten the bolt once the bracket is welded into place. Then final weld or bolt the bracket in place and give it a shot of paint. The bolt holes work great for a plug weld. All right, with all our brackets welded on, we're ready to install this work of art. This high steer knuckle will just go onto the passenger side. What we're going to do is just get it into position so that just get it in position so that when we put our tie rods on there, we'll be able to make sure that they all clear going across. So we'll just get this up into place, then we'll take a look at our steering a little closer. Okay, we've got the drag link here, and we're just going to kind of set it into place and take a look at our clearances to see what we need to do. We're going to try to go with the full high steer on this, and so we're going to come down from the top with the tie rod end down here, as well as the drag link up on top. Now you notice that this knuckle's just through drilled, and they give us some spacers with it that are tapered so that we can insert that taper, go from the top or the bottom. Gives you a lot of versatility for whatever you want to do. So we're going to try to go from the top, so we'll take a look at this, and yeah, first thing we notice is we've got a drop pitman arm on here that needs to go. Before we finalize anything as far as welding on our sway bar mounts or anything like that, we're just going to do a dry run and put all our steering linkage into place, and then we're going to flex the suspension to make sure everything clears. So to start with, we've got these sleeves that we're going to put into our knuckles. We've decided that we're going to go from our pitman arm down to this steering arm on the bottom side, and then our tie rod, we're going to go from the bottom on that as well. That'll give us a lot of room on the top for our linkage. So we'll go ahead and put these sleeves into place. Next up, we'll put our drag link into place. It's got a large taper and a small taper on the studs on it. Go from the bottom on both of them on our new pitman. Next up, tie rod end. First thing you'll notice about these tie rod ends when you go to install them is this unique design on it, how it's got an offset to it. What that's going to do is it's going to give us a lot more clearance between the differential and our tie rod end, so that as you turn, the radius of that circle changes, and it's going to put this right in tight. So if you've got an aftermarket diff cover of some kind that sticks out a lot more, it's going to give you a lot more clearance, and it gives us a lot more room to use a beefy tie rod end on here. We'll go ahead and install this tie rod end into it. We're just going to put them on loose right now. We're not really interested in having everything all cinched up. We just want to check our clearances so we know exactly where to put that sway bar mount. Anytime you do any kind of a major change in your suspension, it's always a good idea to completely cycle it and make sure everything clears. So on our steering, we're just going to turn it lock to lock. Make sure everything clears up here. Our steering, it clears on the differential. Everything looks good. We're getting clear into our stops on both the knuckles. Cycle it the other way. Right now we've got our steering turned clear to the right, so this is the worst case scenario for having our drag link make contact with this sway bar mount. So what we'll do is we'll just saddle this sway bar mount over that inner C on our knuckle and just take a look at it and see if everything is going to clear. And it looks like we've got a lot of clearance here. When this axle hangs down, because this drag link is still attached up here at the pitman arm, that's going to give us the maximum angle that arm will ever be at. So we're at our worst case scenario right now, and it clears great. So before we do any welding on this, we also want to cycle this axle up, because as this axle comes up, it's going to bring our sway bar mount close to that jounce tube up there. So we'll probably bring this in, do us a little tack weld here, then cycle it and make sure it's good. So before we tack weld it, let's clean this up so that we can do our final weld when the time comes. All right, we just threw the spring back in here real quick just so that we can make sure that we've got enough clearance between our bracket and the spring. So he's got it all cleaned up, the inner C's cleaned up, ready to weld. We're just gonna put that on here, position it front to back, split the difference, make sure that that's clearing right there. We wanna make sure that we've got clearance on the back side of it for the spring. Looks like that's sitting pretty nice. So we're just going to tack that into position. We'll slide the spring back out, and then we'll cycle this up and make sure that our bracket's going to clear our jounce tube up here. All right, we'll let this back down and take the spring out so we can cycle it. We pulled this spring back out of the way so that when we flex this, we're not going to have the spring tension trying to lift the Jeep off the rack. So it's just a lot easier to get full compression with that spring out of the way. All right, so that's gone. Let's put our tie rod back in. We're just starting these just so that they're just in place because we're just looking for clearance. The last thing we need to do is throw a track bar back in there, because with the track bar, the axle will arc differently. So we want to have it into position so we know where that axle is going to wind up, left or right. So, we're just going to throw bolts in it. We're going to take all this back apart so we don't care about putting nuts on them. With all our steering linkage in place, now we can flex this axle up and down and really get a good idea of how this is going to clear. Okay, we'll just visually inspect. We're still good here. Our sway bar mount isn't going to hit the frame up here. That looks good. Gobs of room between the jounce tube and the bracket. Room for a spring. We're all good. That looks great. Take it all back apart and remove the spring before final welding of the new sway bar mounts. Oh, we also need to cut off that original sway bar mount. We have the passenger side bracket tacked into place. We'll use it to measure from and to locate the driver's side bracket. Any reference point will work, just as long as we use the same points on both sides. The goal here is to have both links symmetrical. We measured from the center of the bracket hole to the spring perch. Do a quick tack weld and double check your measurements. Visually inspect both brackets and final weld. Caution! If you choose not to remove the ball joints before welding the sway bar mounts, extreme caution needs to be taken so that the ball joints are not damaged by heat. By wrapping the ball joints in a wet shop towel and doing some short welds, you'll have good success. The method is to do a short weld on one side, then move to the other side and weld while the previous weld is cooling. The wet shop towels should be monitored and replaced should the heat start to build. Primer it and paint. Reassemble the knuckles and final torque the ball joints. We'll use 70 foot-pounds on the upper ball joint and 75 on the lower. Getting the steering geometry correct will make all the difference in the way your Jeep will drive. We're looking for the track bar and the drag link to be parallel with each other. Adam is using a string to get a good visual on the final placement of the track bar. On this Jeep, using the lower holes achieved our goal. The track bar is adjustable in length to allow axle centering, which will be finalized on the ground. Install the springs. We want to do that before we install the tie rod ends, just for clearance. We'll install the spring retainers when we put the Jeep on the ground. Install the tie rod ends. Install all 4 grease zerks in the new steering linkage. When tightening the tie rod castle nuts, never back the nut off to achieve cotter pin alignment. Always tighten to the next hole if necessary. Reconnect the sway bar links. Now you may need to change the length of the links if the sway bar arms are pushed up too high because of that new sway bar mount. Reinstall the axle shafts, but be careful to support the inner axle shaft while sliding it into the housing. A little care will prevent inner seal damage, as well as reducing the chance of snow plowing a bunch of axle tube cag into the center section. Reinstall the disc brake rotor and calipers using Loctite and a 13mm. Once the Jeep is back on the ground, double check all your bolts, cotter keys, and so forth. Just make sure everything's tight. When you're all done, go take your mom for a ride. She's gonna love it.